Hi, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Atlanta History Center. We are so happy that you are with us tonight. I'm Claire Haley, Vice President of Author Talks and Democracy Initiatives. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight and to welcome tonight's very special guest. We were just talking backstage, and the last time Douglas Brinkley was here was for his Moonshot book just before COVID, so we're so excited that he is back for his new book tonight. The book, of course, I see many of you have in your hands, is Silent Spring Revolution. If you have not yet gotten your copy of the book, it's available for sale out in the lobby for 25% off tonight only. And Mr. Brinkley will also be personalizing books after the event tonight if you would like to get yours signed. Now, a little bit about tonight's guest, Douglas Brinkley. Douglas Brinkley is a Catherine Brown Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University. He's the presidential historian for the New York Historical Society, a trustee of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, and a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He has won many distinguished prizes for his role in the environmental movement and for his work. His book, The Great Deluge, received the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award. He was awarded a Grammy for Presidential Suite and is the recipient of 7 honorary doctorates in American Studies. His 2-volume annotated Nixon tapes won the Arthur S. Link Warren Cool Prize. He lives in Austin, Texas, and we're so happy that he's joining us in Atlanta, Georgia tonight. Please join me in welcoming Douglas Brinkley.
Thank you, guys. Happy holidays to you. I'm really pleased to be in Atlanta because this is where I was born, Crawford Long Hospital. Yes, we can hear it for Crawford Long. And, I've come here periodically with family, and this is this place that's very special to me. So whenever I have a book come out, I make sure I go to the Atlanta History Center. This book is special because when I grew up here in Atlanta, my mother was a teacher, and we had a trailer and pulled by a Pontiac, and we would go all over the United States to all of our national parks. I mean, in Georgia, we would go to the Okefenokee, or we'd go to the little White House of FDR or Callaway Gardens and the like, but then we would go from the Great Smoky Mountains and Shenandoah National Park in Arcadia in the east to Yellowstone and Yosemite and Olympic National Park in the west. And so it was always, it really excited me. And wherever I went as a little kid to all these national parks, I'd pull a pamphlet up, as they would do in those days, and it would say that somehow or other, Theodore Roosevelt had something to do with creating it. And so I adopted TR as sort of a hero, which also manifested itself because I had asthma as a boy, and Theodore Roosevelt had asthma. And then the other figure, wherever I pulled a pamphlet, I would find was FDR. And so I started writing about the natural world, environmental history, first with my book, The Wilderness Warrior, on Theodore Roosevelt, John Muir, Gifford Pinchot's generation. They saved 234 million acres of wild America. Theodore Roosevelt did epic things like stand on the lip of the Grand Canyon and say, "Do not touch it. God has made it. You will only mar it. Leave the Grand Canyon alone." And when Congress moved to mine it for zinc, asbestos, and copper, TR ended up, saying, "No, we're going to save it," and he signed an executive order for it. Is somebody ringing a lot? Oh. There we go. Yeah. Oh, right. And so wherever we go when I was mentioning with Theodore Roosevelt, I wrote a book, The Wilderness Warrior, and that is the first wave of an environmental movement. That's when TR injected conservation into our national parlance. He created what is today's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with 51 bird reservations. He started protecting endangered species like the bison and the elk. As president, TR wrote a book called The Deer Family. The second wave, which I picked up on when I was young, was Franklin D. Roosevelt. And FDR, wherever in life he wrote an application, he would put that his job occupation was tree farmer. And he ended up being born on the Hudson River, living his whole life on the Hudson River. Eleanor Roosevelt said if you slashed him open, he'd bleed the Hudson River. And that included the Hudson River Valley painting and the stories of Rip Van Winkle and the Catskills. And FDR, we think about the Great Depression and the stock market collapsing, but FDR was a North New York politician. And so he was all about the dirt farmers and orchard people and the agriculture crops. And we had destroyed the United States in the 1930s. FDR created agricultural adjustment centers. He saved national parks like the Everglades, Smokies, Channel Islands, and beyond. And he created over 800 state parks. And we had the Civilian Conservation Corps planted billions of trees around the country from 1933 to 1942. Unemployed workers getting $1 a day to plant a tree. So I wrote that book up, The Rightful Heritage. So that's the first one, waves TR. Second wave, FDR. Third wave is the book, Silent Spring Revolution. The third environmental movement took place in this country from 1960 to 1963. And it didn't have a Roosevelt attached to it. In fact, the presidents were important and get high marks for their leadership, but it was really a people's movement, a groundswell of wanting change. And the key moment for the third wave was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Because while many people celebrated VJ Day and we won the war and all the rest, there became a deep skepticism that we had unleashed an ugly genie across the land. That and that even though there's only one time in world history a country has a nuclear monopoly, the United States, 1945 to 1949, but the here, let him get that. That's why they do those announcements we should have done today beforehand. We all do that sometimes, no big deal. From 1945 to 1949 is the only time in world history one country had a nuclear monopoly. But a man named Norman Cousins wrote a book right after Nagasaki called Is Man Obsolete? And he started talking about the atomic bomb could destroy the planet, and that you'd have to have great faith in human nature to not feel that a debacle would eventually occur due to this new nuclear might. More to the point, the United States government began testing nuclear weapons really willy-nilly, one after the other, in the Marshall Islands and particularly Nevada, where they would explode and detonate atomic bombs to test. Well, at those days, before an environmental justice movement, people thought, well, it's indigenous people, poor ranchers, Mexican Americans that might get sick from the fallout. Well, they did. But it also blew all across America. And so in the 1950s, one strand that leads to the environmental movement is the anti-nuclear testing movement. Largely women's groups, Women Strike for Peace. Norman Cousins founded SANE, which became a huge protest organization. And it really started making a mark when a doctor, Barry Commoner, at Washington University found that was studying teeth and was finding radiation in our bodies, contamination. And out of that strand, the anti-nuclear movement, it hits its biggest high water mark when in 1963, John F. Kennedy, as president, signs the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, banning the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere or underwater. And I write about it in my book as an ecological event, the stopping of it. Keep that one strand in mind, the anti-nuclear movement, which Rachel Carson, who I'm going to talk about, is part of. A second post-war fear was DDT, another great substance that helped the United States win World War II. If you were a soldier fighting in the Pacific, you blessed yourself for DDT because you were afraid of getting a malarial disease, of getting, lice or ticks, mosquito bites. And instead, this pesticide, protected you. And it was seen like Aladdin's lamp, presto, this new chemical, DDT, mass applied, we'd aerial spray Guam or Iwo Jima of it. The same man who protested nuclear weapons, public scientist Barry Commoner, was protesting DDT early because he was a genius, Brooklyn, he was Jewish descent, Brooklyn, who went to Harvard, did his PhD, and Commoner was the one in World War II devised the mechanisms to spray the DDT. And he saw it killing fish, vegetation. He saw what it was doing to wildlife, and he realized that humans are a form of life too, and we will be contaminated from DDT. So that anti-DDT movement, which I'm going to get to Rachel Carson in a minute, it's another big strand in the 1950s. Third lane, there's a wilderness lobby, which is a little more Theodore Roosevelt-like. That could be outdoors people that hunt and fish, love the national parks, or outdoor recreationists. And they believed that we needed vast parcels of land, 1 million acres here, 1 million acres there, that were roadless. Because they thought that roads brought in logging trucks, roads brought in the mineral extraction companies, roads brought in porta potties and electricity and things we're usually grateful for, but it was too much of a human imprint on everything. And the Wilderness Lobby believed we needed to leave big parts of America untouched. And that the leader in that was really the Sierra Club, who in 1955, under Executive Director David Brower, and also a man named Howard Zahniser of the Wilderness Society, stopped a dam from being built that would have desecrated Dinosaur National Monument in Utah, Colorado. And by stopping that dam, they were making a larger statement: leave the parks alone. You cannot dam because you're going to ruin the terrain. And it was an epic victory for them. And they were promoting a wilderness bill, which Hubert Humphrey was the first Democrat senator, promoted it in the 50s. And in 1964, Lyndon Johnson will sign the Wilderness Act, and all of you own wilderness. You can go to the William O. Douglas Wilderness in Washington State, or Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana, or Gaylord Nelson Wilderness in Wisconsin. We do today, as part of our heritage, have these vast areas. And there was a fourth lane, seashore protection. A book came out in the mid-1950s by the U.S. government where we used to do these extraordinary booklets and pamphlets and that were not only erudite, but were handsome and photographically appealing. But in our Vanishing Shorelines, they talked about everybody wants to build on the oceans. Just look at Florida, build, or the Jerseyization of casinos and boardwalks or jetties, and that there would be no open beach left for the public in America if we didn't act immediately. And that seashore preservation found a young senator attracted to it. That's John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy starts in the late 50s, and he was a bit of a lazy senator. He was not a workhorse like a Lyndon Johnson or something, but a Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, an FDR appointee, convinced Kennedy to hook on to seashore preservation. And Kennedy pushed through and signed in 1961 Cape Cod National Seashore. He then did Point Reyes National Seashore in California, Padre Island National Seashore in Texas. He then, with Stuart Udall, had a list of seashores to be protected. And we go all over, and it comes out of this fear of vanishing seashores to the point where Nixon does Cumberland Island, Georgia. Johnson, Assateague, and in Maryland and Virginia. Johnson, Fire Island, New York. And they said the Great Lakes are this resource that are being destroyed, and we must move in to protect them. And they saved the Great Dunes and Sleeping Bear up in upstate of Michigan, or the Apostle Islands, 22 islands in Wisconsin, which I mentioned, or Indiana Dunes in Illinois and Indiana, along the, on the Great Lakes. So there was a Great Lakes protection movement part of it too. Playing into all of these was Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was from Springdale, Pennsylvania. As a little girl, she couldn't believe that the Allegheny River was being so spoiled and ruined, polluted. And there were glue factories and just people used it with untreated sewage. And Rachel Carson was at an early age, had a wonder for nature. And she would walk and collect things, fossils or pine cones, birds' nests, started reading it all. Rachel Carson also wrote well. As a young girl, she had essays published in St. Nicholas magazine, which was a big deal back then. And she went to school at a place called Chatham University, which is right outside of Pittsburgh, and it was a women's school. Today it's co-ed. But there she met a professor who noticed that she had a genius, Rachel Carson, for science, biology, and wrote like an angel. And that set her up to make a life, what nobody saw right away is her life would be a marine biologist, a writer of oceans. And she never saw the ocean until after college, when she went to Woods Hole, Massachusetts, which is walking distance practically from the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport. Woods Hole in the early America, in the 1920s, 30s, early 20th century and beyond, but it was the place if you cared about marine life. This is before Atlanta has an aquarium or before University of Texas has a way station in Port Aransas, Texas, or University of Miami's developed a program. Before even Scripps in California got all of its juice, Woods Hole had the best marine library. Red brick buildings along the ocean, trawlers would come in. They would find new specimens of sea life. And she became a microscope person. She would also go to the wharfs. She got very interested in eels, which do these amazing migratory journeys, like across the Atlantic into river systems. And she wrote about them. She gets hired to write for the Baltimore Sun. About nature, she does her master's in zoology at Johns Hopkins University. And in World War II, she's hired to work for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, doing radio scripts, pamphlets, brochures, and really our in-house ocean expert. And in 1941, she writes her first book, Under the Sea Wind, and she'll go on to write a trilogy, 3 books about the oceans that are even today our finest books about the outdoor world, ocean life. They're spectacular. They're classics like Henry David Thoreau's Walden. I mean, she's compared to the Emerson and Whitman. She's one of our great writers, Rachel Carson. And during her stint during World War II, she was going to a place called Pawtuxet, Maryland. We all own Pawtuxet. It's a Pawtuxet Wildlife Research Center, and it may not make the front news or scroll on CNN, but every day, then and now, at Pawtuxet, we test water, air, and chemicals and how they're affecting species. And at Pawtuxet, Rachel Carson found out from our best government scientists that all of these pesticides and DDT in particular were causing animal lives to get sick. And that radiation from atomic weapons could kill a complete atoll from the fallout if blown up in the ocean. And so she's making best-selling books. You know, I'm lucky you get a best-selling book a couple weeks, you make a list. She would be on for 60 weeks straight with her books. Pre-Jacques Cousteau, she was the great literary voice of the oceans. And she picks up all those strands I mentioned to you: wilderness, anti-DDT, anti-nuclear, national parks, wilderness. She's for all. She pulls them all together. And she starts gathering, a big event happens in late 50s. Does anybody here remember a man named Dr. Benjamin Spock? He was a famous baby doctor. His sister, Marjorie Spock, on Long Island, became an organic farmer. And she had a serious parcel of land and wanted to make that her livelihood. Yet the United States Department of Agriculture in Suffolk County was sprayed with crop planes, dusting and spraying all over. And she said, I can't be they're taking away my living as an organic farmer. I'm opposed to pesticides. And Marjorie Spock sues the government, manufacturing companies, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And she loses. But in her loss was a victory, because William O. Douglas, who I mentioned, Supreme Court Justice from Yakima, Washington, wrote one of the most incredible dissents in American history about that, the right to clean air, water, the right that she had to not, who owns, it's a great for law students, whatever side you take or sides you take, who owns the air above your property? Who has the right, to take away your solitude with airplanes there in an airport? They were starting to get at, in his dissent, the big issues that would explode in the ecology, environmental movement. And when I use the word ecology, Eugene Odom of University of Georgia's textbook on ecology got inserted into the schools all over the place, and ecology was becoming a big deal. I should just say about Douglas, I think most of you are here at Atlanta History Center realize FDR tried to pack the Supreme Court. He won a big victory in 1936. The Supreme Court was undoing some of his New Deal measures. He wanted to go from 9 justices to 15, and he went for it. Today they banner about it. He went for it, the hubris, and he got shot down. But he got his revenge when a seat opened up and he put in William O. Douglas in 1937. Douglas is the longest serving Supreme Court justice, and he is an environmental activist on steroids. Douglas couldn't walk when he was young in Yakima. He learned to hike around Washington. He eventually hoboed around and then went to New York City at Columbia, became a Sterling professor at law, and was hired by old Joe Kennedy during the Great Depression to oversee the Security Exchange Commission to bust companies that were doing fake bankruptcies. So he is all geared up from his background to bust companies that pollute. It's his specialty. You don't want Douglas looking into your books if you're a chemical company or an oil gas concern or pipeline. He'd be the last person you want digging. And he loved John Muir, loved the outdoors world. In 1951, he went to the Himalayas and practiced Buddhism. Supreme Court Justice, practicing Buddhism. Wrote a book on the Himalayas. Wrote two books called My Wilderness. One for the Pacific, one for the East, of places that needed to be saved as Supreme Court Justice. And he was the Kennedys' uncle. He brought Bobby Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, not the one alive today, the senator from New York and assassinated in Los Angeles, took him all over hiking and backpacking Siberia. Douglas. He was a tutor to the Kennedy family on the outdoor world. He's the one who got Jack Kennedy involved with Cape Cod preservation. And now he's writing The Dissent, backing Rachel Carson, and is helping Carson find information which she uses to write Silent Spring, a book that comes out in 1962. She's writing that book in the late 50s and 60s. Rachel Carson gets all of that. Even though she lost her law case at the Supreme Court, she got given to her all of the findings and information that when you go to the Supreme Court, lawyers find. And then she had her friends in the U.S. government, whistleblowers of sorts, but people that leaked her or gave her information about chemical contamination going on. And she wrote like an angel, as I said, but she was suffering from breast cancer, doing radiation treatments, had lost her hair, would wear a wig. She would be in Silver Spring, Maryland, writing, and on a race against death to finish her book. And in early 62, Justice Douglas told the New Frontier Kennedy people, let's back Rachel. She's coming out. This book's going to be dynamite. And Rachel Carson first was excerpted in the New Yorker. Then her book came out, and it was going to come out later in the fall. But the articles in the New Yorker were such a big deal, front page news, that Kennedy at a podium, President Kennedy was asked about it. And it's a great moment in presidential history because Kennedy said, I know about Ms. Carson's research, and we're going to go everything and find out what she's charging. Meaning he hired the best scientists to look into it, which is all you want of a president. Give us the real deal. The critics of Rachel Carson said she's making it up, she's hysterical, that she's has cancer, so she's exaggerating chemicals, all on and on, a smear campaign, a coordinated smear campaign against her. Kennedy put the best MIT-like scientists on the case and found out Rachel Carson was right. And her book held up. And in American history, there are few books like that. I mean, Thomas Paine with Common Sense at the American Revolution, Zebulon Pike's Western Exploration Journal started Western expansion in many ways. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Jungle of Upton Sinclair with Theodore Roosevelt did the meat packings. So this is a book, Sound Spring, that had a wallop. And Carson was bringing all those strands together. And what she was connecting was that environment is public health. That your children could get sick playing in a lawn from chemicals. That your dog could die jumping in a river. That the pollution has gotten, and the pesticides have gotten so bad that nothing short of human life was at stake. That is why my book's called Silent Spring Revolution. It blew up. And it led to the 60s, long 60s environmental movement in earnest. And in my book, Rachel Carson dies in 1964 from cancer. She was only alive less than 2 years after her book. She testified in the Senate. She went on with Eric Severide on CBS for hour interviews. She spoke with Walter Cronkite. She did all that. But in her death, there became in America the DDT wars. And from 1962, her publication, to 1972, when Nixon is president, there's a fight over DDT, which is a fight to regulate the chemical industries in America. The thousands of chemicals were being, and what Carson and her acolytes were arguing wasn't about banning, it was about regulating, studying, looking at cause and effect. What's the effect on the natural world? What's the potential of harm to wildlife and humans? And it gets banned, DDT, in 1972 under William Ruckelshaus, the first head of the Environmental Protection Agency. And so there's a victory in sight, even though Rachel Carson wasn't alive for it. But what she sparked was immense because it started what's called the Sue the Bastards, which is the birth of environmental law. William O. Douglas really started it, but by 1967, the Environmental Defense Fund goes after people spraying DDT by suing. And suddenly these cities decide they don't want to sue, so they won't use DDT. They'll use something different for to kill pestilence. And all of these groups are born. You might hear about, Natural Resource Defense Counselor, Sierra Club Defense Fund. It's now a new field, environmental law. But that 67, environmental law really takes hold when Nixon is president. I'm going to tell you about that in a moment. But as for Kennedy, his death, he left the best Secretary of Interior in American history in Stuart Udall. Udall wrote a book I highly recommend called The Quiet Crisis. And Udall was an integrationist and was also looking at disparities in and race and how we treat where poor people or people of color, marginalized people live, where we put the junk and debris of our hyper-industrial society into their neighborhoods. I was on NPR today, the program 1A, with Robert Stanton, the first black park ranger with the Grand Tetons, and he was taken out of a college to go there. And then Stanton went on Bill Clinton eventually appointed him the head of the whole National Park Service. But that's Stuart Udall that was doing the integration. And it was Johnson, LBJ, after the death of Kennedy with his wife Lady Bird, that started fighting for environmental quality. And it came in many different ways. One, Ralph Nader published a book, Unsafe at Any Speed, about the auto industries, but he was also talking about leaded gasoline. And there became a movement to get lead out of gasoline. And young people will not remember that, but it was a big deal to suddenly have non-leaded and lower the speed limit, get the speed limit to 55 to save gas. Alternative energy is starting to come. Indigenous people, Native Americans, are in protest mood over saving environmental sacred sites. Whether it's in the Navajo lands in the Southwest, or up in the Chippewa up in Minnesota. I write in the book about the American Indian movement that's born out of the taking of Alcatraz Island in California, which is today a national park. And bringing an awareness, because many Native Americans had a better relationship to land stewardship in their thinking than the Euro-Americans who came. And that seeped in with the counterculture. This is the irony. LBJ's going on, he'll create Canyonlands National Park. And with Lady Bird, they save Redwood National Park in California. A big campaign to save the North Cascades. But Johnson's talking also about urban wilderness, outdoor recreation near poor areas, that we need to have clean rivers, waters. Lady Bird would go out and walk around the Anacostia River to help collect garbage and dump that had been put there by the housing projects to set an example. I was there last week along the Anacostia, where there's a Matthew Henson Ecological Center. Matthew Henson went to the original expedition to the North Pole and was an African-American who got forgotten about a lot. But in that poor neighborhood, largely black neighborhood now, they're training, they bring in hawks and raptors to school kids to start learning about the wild in an urban environment. Martin Luther King famously said over and over again, some iteration of, what good does it do to integrate the lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, if the milk we're drinking is contaminated with strontium-90? Meaning, we can fight these civil rights battles, but if we're poisoning all of us ourselves, it's a fool's errand. And his wife, Coretta Scott King, was the fiercest leader of the anti-nuclear testing movement in America. She was a leader of the Ban the Bomb movement. And you know who else emerges out of the environmental movement of the 1960s? Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta out of the Imperial Valley and Coachella Valley in Central California, San Joaquin, because of pesticides, where we were spraying these crops, and all of the Mexican-American or agricultural workers, Filipinos, and others were getting deathly ill from all of these contaminations on the fields, let alone no sanitary conditions, no education, no other things. But it was really an environmental protest that Chavez was launching. He ended his life, Chavez, becoming an organic farmer, just like Marjorie Spock. There were Beat Generation writers. Jack Kerouac wrote about the North Cascades and the Dharma Bums. Gary Snyder, our great Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, wrote about Turtle Island, is what Native people had called America. And he was raising consciousness. Books like The Whole Earth Catalog by Stuart Brand. Even our space program of going to NASA, and with NASA astronauts like Pete Conrad and others Bill Anders, others would go, and they thought that they were looking at the moon, and they were headed there. But what took their breath away was seeing planet Earth, blue-white planet floating in this sea of darkness, and that how we're all alone here on this planet, and that in addition to a moon shot, we need an Earth shot. And and then Walter Cronkite started doing that these called Earthrise photo as his bumper slide on the nightly news. And Lyndon Johnson, out of all the things he did, the one I most appreciate personally is he signed the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and the National Trails Act. He saved the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Coast Trail, our whole trail systems. And he put hunks of rivers, stretches, all over the United States that aren't dammed. Jimmy Carter in here, Georgia, got famous for being against the dam on the Flint River. But there became a movement with some people not to build dams because they're destroying the ecological integrity of them. But Wild and Scenic Rivers, if you go around the country, there's some of the prettiest stretches of outdoor natural wilderness we have, and it's a great classification. Now, this brings us to the Vietnam, and that's why Lady Bird gets a lot of attention, and I write about her a lot in the book of all of her incredible, and she would go down to Big Bend in Texas on a raft trip, or go in the Snake River in Oregon, and she's unbelievable. But Vietnam War turned the left against Democrat Lyndon Johnson. And, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? 58,000 Americans killed in Vietnam, untold, illnesses and most ironically, you're saving wild and scenic rivers in America while you're spraying Agent Orange, destroying the Mekong Delta. Why would Lyndon do that, or what? He thought of a heritage as America. He was an A+ when it came to conservation stewardship in the United States, but he had no global vision that somebody like Jimmy Carter would have, of looking at the earth as one pulsing biological organism. Nixon had no interest in the environment, and he procured the Republican nomination in '68. Yet, he was being asked questions about it a lot, and the only Republican, conservative Republican, I'd say, that he knew that really knew the environmental game was John Ehrlichman of Seattle, who will later go to prison for Watergate crimes. But Ehrlichman was a land water lawyer in Seattle. And Nixon encountered him in the early 60s. And his law firm made a lot of money on NIMBY projects, meaning wealthy Seattle residents would pull together a neighborhood and say, we don't want an aluminum plant in our neighborhood, or we don't want a strip mall built here. So you'd hire Ruckelshaus to represent your community. So it was a NIMBY environmental law, and he was really good at it. And so Nixon told Ruckelshaus, once he appointed him as domestic advisor in '69, you do the environment. I want nothing to do with it. I'm doing foreign policy, military affairs, Vietnam. You do it. David Brower of the Sierra Club calls it a great blessing because Ehrlichman was what he called a covert green. There was a guy in the White House running domestic affairs who got it, who got clean air, got clean water, got the need for sewage treatment plants, got the need for more parks. He at least got it. And that's half the battle. He was part of them. And then, lo and behold, Nixon's only president days. And you have the tragedy of the Santa Barbara oil spill. Now, television only turned color in 1967 for nightly news, late 67. And now here it's January '69. Color TV going into people's living rooms, showing Santa Barbara paradise, blue water, just destroyed by an oil spill. Birds stuck in goo, became a nonprofit group out there, goo, get the oil out. Islands destroyed, marine wildlife, the media clicking away photos, films, a nightmare for Nixon. Fairly enough, Nixon said, don't blame me, I've been president days. Johnson's the one who greenlit the lease that led to the, blame game. But Nixon went, he walked the site, and he heard the outrage. And, historians like myself, we read other people's mail for a living. And I went to the Nixon library. I was at the Carter Library today or met with the director there for my own purposes. But there are these just bags of letters about Santa Barbara coming to Nixon. You can't miss how many people are upset in California, including Republican donors. I bought a house in Laguna Beach or Dana Point or Long Beach. What are you doing? We shouldn't be allowing this along the Pacific. And then the summer of '69, the Cuyahoga River caught fire in Ohio. And Dr. Seuss declared Lake Erie dead, Theodore Geisel. And the novelist Kurt Vonnegut said, the Great Lakes is nothing but human excrement and Clorox bottles. It was dying. And here, when we're saying the Cuyahoga River on fire, it means if you lit a match and put it on the water, poof, it goes up in a flame. And it's same with the Rouge River happened in Michigan. It got less coverage. And so by late '69, there's this idea by Gaylord Nelson, the senator of Wisconsin, to create Earth Day as a teach-in, where the whole country talks about ecology and saving planet Earth. It was student-driven, funded by Walter Reuther, the head of the United Automobile Workers. And Nixon's realizing, this is April 22nd, 1970. I either am going to get smashed on Earth Day or I'm going to try to become part of a change agent, if you like. Well, Nixon hated one human more than any other human, and that's saying a lot for a man who kept enemies list. Ed Muskie of Maine. He is convinced that Muskie is the Republican nominee for president in 1972, that Muskie is grandstanding on clean air and clean water, that anything Nixon does positive for the environment, Muskie takes to the microphones and says it wasn't enough. And he tells Ehrlichman, I'll sign what you guys cook up with Scoop Jackson, the senator from Washington State, because Scoop was not opposed to the Vietnam War, and yet was an environmentalist, conservationist, meaning the list of any Democrats, if you have memory of them, were all opposing the Vietnam War by late '69, '70. Ted Kennedy, Eugene McCarthy, Hubert Humphrey, Frank Church of Idaho, Muskie, Gaylord Nelson. The list is long. And there's there's Scoop Jackson with Boeing in the military out there in Seattle, saying, no, he was a neocon sort of, yet a conservationist. So Nixon said, I will sign up if Jackson does something. Well, Jackson hired great lawyers for his staff. I was impressed in research how good Jackson's legal minds were around him. Ted Kennedy had a great Senate staff too. But and they created NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. This may bore you, NEPA, but all of your lives are affected by NEPA. NEPA. Nixon signs it January 1, 1970 at San Clemente, his home in California. NEPA says that you can't build things without an environmental impact statement. So, if you're going to build, the U.S. government wants to build a facility, how is it going to affect the environment? You're going to build something here in Buckhead, how's it affecting the environment? NEPA's powerful. If you want to find something that the Trump Republican Party would like to undo, it is Nixon's NEPA, which was really drafted in Scoop Jackson's Senate office with the help of Democrat John Dingell. of Michigan. And NEPA's powerful. And it becomes a defining moment. Now, Earth Day, Nixon gives a State of the Union in 1970 where 1/3 of the entire State of the Union is on environment. And if I played it to you now, you would think it was a progressive left AOC liberal if you heard Nixon on the environment in his State of the Union in early. It's shocking how our country's changed. But Nixon was suspicious of Earth Day as being a pinko commie plot. He thought it was hippies, new lefters, counterculture types. But on the other hand, he didn't want to become the butt of it all. And this is pre-Kent State, pre-Cambodia, so he's still, thinking about the youth vote and all this. So he plants a tree that day in a suit. You can see him planting an Earth Day tree. And he gave Interior Department employees the day off to do school teaching things, which was good. But he also had the FBI infiltrate all the Earth Day offices they could to get dirt on what they were up to. And one of the more funny memos is John Ehrlichman writing to Pete McCloskey, who was a liberal Republican from California, saying, oh, God, I've got to go see the boss, Nixon. He wants to know about the commie infiltration of Earth Day. And the report from the FBI says it's a lot of girls smooching under a tree. There's a little pot. People were kicking a ball around. There were dogs. Like, nothing bad really happened. This is just like kids, having an Earth Day. And Nixon now realizes that environment has traction. And in the summer of 1970, he creates the Environmental Protection Agency. Out of the White House, it opens its doors in December 1970 with Ruckelshaus as the chief law enforcement officer, and they go after people. I mean, we forget EPA is law enforcement. It's saying, you're breaking this NEPA. Just like we do civil rights history, you can pass Brown versus Topeka to integrate schools, right? Big deal, Brown versus Topeka, 1954. But the whole civil rights movement afterwards, whether it's Little Rock Central High or whether it's New Orleans, Franz Elementary, it's making places follow the law of Brown versus Topeka. So after what Ruckelshaus has to do is make people follow NEPA. Anybody in Atlanta trying to build something, where's your environmental impact statement? I mean, you're not building. That's the law, guys. And you can see how the construction industry, oil and gas industry, extraction industries hate this. Commercial real estate developers, starting to get a pretty big group of people that aren't real happy with NEPA, and they're not happy that Nixon turned liberal on them. And Nixon's doing this triangulation dance. He's a little like Bill Clinton. He's such a politician, He's just weaving his way through everything. And yet Nixon signs the Clean Air Act in 1970, does that we get in 72. He wasn't thrilled about it. The Clean Water Act that we're living on today, a big one, the Endangered Species Act of 73. And you know what the Endangered Species Act, saving the eagle from extinction, saving manatees, key deer, condor, whooping cranes. I mean, it's endless. But Endangered Species Act, you know what it passed the Senate? 92-0. That's how bipartisan it was. It was Democratic run. The energy was coming out of the Democrats, but where there were still a lot of Theodore Roosevelt, Republican, conservationist in the mix to make all that third wave happen. But it ends, and incidentally, I should say Earth Day still was incredible in all of these songs that came out of it, like Marvin Gaye, Mercy Me, The Ecology, or Pete Seeger's trying to save the Hudson River and stop Con Edison from building a plant, or stopping of a nuclear power plant in Bodega Bay, California, that would have been built on the San Andreas Fault. And did you realize Andy Warhol did a whole series of endangered species? You can just punch online Andy Warhol endangered species, and you'll see them. Robert Rauschenberg, the great painter, did the poster for Earth Day. And everybody was getting into it. I mean, even Walt Disney, who was a Goldwater Republican, loved animals. He made his life animating animals. And he loved outdoor animals, including cougar in his backyard in the canyons of California, because he would look at how their muscles move and their habits. And, his films did a lot. True Life Adventure, Disney Adventures of showing the life of an animal. So there's a lot of things happening. And then 1973, the same time as the Endangered Species Act, Nixon's under fire for Watergate. His minister, after winning a landslide in 72, by 73, he's diminished. And with that, you have the OPEC oil embargo. Due to the Israeli war, Nixon sides with Israel. The Arab states unite together on oil pricing, and our gas prices go up. We hit inflation, and there becomes an outrage that the environmental movement, the Rachel Carson Revolution, went so far that now we have to do energy independence. And not equally important, in 1971, a man named Lewis Powell, who became a Supreme Court justice in 72, writes the Powell Memorandum. And the Powell Memorandum, he was the chief tobacco lobbyist, Lewis Powell, out of Virginia, made a fortune, and the tobacco people were furious of labels not being forced on cigarette packages and banning of TV commercials of cigarettes. And the tobacco lobby said, capitalism's going to die. The federal government's regulating everything. And Powell writes the head of the Chambers of Commerce and says, we've got to create an alternative counter-revolution to the Rachel Carson, Ralph Nader, William O. Douglas revolution. And they have such a head start on us that it's going to take us 30 or 40 years to catch up. Because they've taken over ABC, CBS, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, the mainstream media. They've taken all the professors at the universities have taken over. Powell's saying, why don't we have the money donors take over and not give the power to the faculty? They're taking, Hollywood. We've got to go do films that have alternative messages. What Powell was saying is, we are now hated. You work for oil and gas, you're being demonized, and it's going to get worse. Out of this Powell memo is born Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, the Koch brothers, Coors, Scafee, all of it of today's right. And they did get their own TV network with Fox, and they did get their own media. And if you flip on tonight, you'll see the New York Post on Hunter Biden, and they did insert themselves into university affairs in a whole new way. It was a counter-revolution of the right. And what goaded them was regulation, money. They were afeared that environmentalism was socialism, and that they were the representatives of laissez-faire capitalism. And there was an epic fight going on between the two. And they were blindsided in the 60s by guys like Douglas at the Supreme Court and Rachel Carson effect, and they hated the media, and the media showing dead fish every night on TV, and that's where we're at today, guys. They created a successful counter-revolution, and we're looking for the fourth wave in the environmental. What's the fourth environmental wave, which is climate change, and which has to much more difficult. Climate has to be global, and it's going to have to be, it's not easy. But I'm hopeful about Generation Z. All the young kids today are deeply concerned about climate. I mean, it's incredible. I'm a professor at Rice. I've been teaching since 1989. I've never seen young people as engaged as this new group is on the environment. And, Greta became their big early hero of their teen years, but it's gone much further than that. And then California has now put that they're going to not sell cars based on fossil fuels in 2035. You won't be able to sell a gasoline car in California or Washington. Now, if you get 10 states that do that, you're starting to have marketplace change, because Ford Motor and GM don't care, or Toyota. They're like, well, just buy my car. We don't care what you put in it. And there'll be new solar batteries coming in. But we're not there yet. There was almost a fourth wave with Al Gore, Inconvenient Truth. You still had about 8 Republicans that were climate warrior senators. There was a moment, and the moment went up in flames when Gore lost in 2000. And it ended up being the Iraq War, Afghanistan. We have other agenda items, and climate never gets the top. The midterm election we just had, it was like 4th or 5th. It's always mentioned daily somewhere on front page New York Times, a news story. It's out there. So we'll have to see how it goes. It's tougher when it's international, because we might build it, but I do think the leadership will come from our country, because we use up the most natural resources, and whatever emanates out of the United States spreads. And so there's a chance for us to be a leader in a new energy era, a cleaner, more efficient America. And we'll look for the fourth wave, and I hope I'm alive when it kicks in earnest. The only thing I could tell you from what you learned from the third wave, or the Silent Spring Revolution, it takes a lot of people. We have the power, the people, but you have to demand it. Guys like Nixon, they can be swayed if they're getting the mail, if they're hearing the pressure. If they're, most of these people in the Senate are transactional characters. There's some ideologues on each side or whatever, but most just want to do what their representatives. So when we make enough noise, they will respond. And it's hard to make a lot of noise when there's so many problems going on, including the COVID pandemic that we've all endured and the like. But at any rate, I hope you enjoy the book. Thank you for listening, and I'd love to take some questions.
Everyone want to start us off with the questions? I'll walk the mic to you. You're a brave soul to be the first question. Got one, thank you.
What's your diagnosis as to the federal government, EPA, and other entities helping on all these matters?
Well, the problem is with the EPA is it's been demonized into the sense that, they may, and I blame them for not doing public relations better, meaning Forest Service has Smokey the Bear. What's the EPA symbol? I know that sounds superficial, but we're not feeling all the good work they do, keeping our life quality sustainable. Most challenging for me studying this is the way new administrations come in and just fire biologists. Our biologists are our best frontline protection in this world. They're the last people you want to get rid of that are telling you about, water quality and the like, but that unfortunately happens. So I hope the demonization of the EPA, we find a way to stop it. And I think the EPA has to find a way to not act like the IRS or just the bad guys, but to explain themselves of how they're making our lives better.
I am rereading Thomas Friedman's book, Flat, Hot, and Crowded, which I read years ago. I think it was written like in 2008 or something like that. The question I have for you is, who can lead the fourth wave? Because we don't have any Teddy Roosevelts, we don't have any FDRs, we don't have any, Douglas, on the Supreme Court. I mean, who can lead this way?
It's a great question, and I don't see anybody right now.
No, I don't either.
And I say that with dismay, and that's why I mentioned, I think what's going to happen is marketplace pressures with states, in this case blue states, starting to do state legislation on things that it becomes so large that it bleeds into the nation at large. So I think the change agent may not be a person, but it might be called the Pacific Coast. Oregon, Washington, California have been educating their citizens about environmental protection for decades, and it has seeped in. I almost got chills saying it because I have 3 kids, and it seeped into our school systems. There have been a lot of failures, but we've gotten the message enough in there that I think people are in those 3 states aware of it, and they are all 3 climate zones. Everywhere is affected by climate. I just canceled my flight to speak at the Clinton Library because of a freakish storm coming to Little Rock, tomorrow. But California, with those wildfires in the summer in North Pacific, oof, that in Florida are just bullseyes. And Florida's view is, screw it, let's just go forward and the ostrich in the sand approach. And California is saying, no, we're going to fight this and innovate. That's what we are as Californians. And Washington and Oregon, I was very impressed of how well states like Oregon invented things like the recycling of bottles or how we recycle things. A lot of things came out of the state of Oregon, which is, and it's not a right-left thing up there, it's a quality of life thing. Might be because there's such beauty around them, it's for various reasons, but it's in the water up there. So that would be my answer. Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Do you feel at all encouraged by the passage of the IRA? Do you think that's going to help us get to the next step?
I think so. I think it was all you can do right now is keep climate on the front, do things with encouraging companies. I just saw, I didn't read it carefully, so I don't want to over talk about, but today a lot of money going into Ohio for these new solar batteries that are cutting edge. And I think the stimulus of all of that will eventually, it's setting a stage for when a 4th wave could come in because there had been the seeding of it. And so that's it. And you can't get anything more than that done right now, not with this gridlock. You can't do 50-50 all the time. If on the environment, we need, if you care about parks and lakes and wildlife also, I'm talking about you need about 6-7 Republicans on board, and they're not there right now. But it's going to help to demonize them either. And one thing I've learned not to do is I know nobody can, it's not fair to ask people what's their carbon footprint. It's just so ridiculous because it's so hard. And we all feel bad. We're having a plastic straw. We're all feeling bad. We may be using gas. We shouldn't be. What can we do? I mean, we don't need to be, and I always tell young people, never get depressed. I mean, the whole point of my book is that these people believe they can make a difference, and they did. You got to fight, you got to believe, and have fun doing it. They had fun in this. Earth Day was a blast. I mean, of content. I mean, it was, so you've got to bring some joy into it, not just dour. And I also tell people, look, if you don't want to do a climate, pick a local waterway, a river, be a friend of a national park, get engaged with grassroots, local, civic conservation, garden clubs, I mean, just be a little bit engaged. You don't have to give a lot of your time, but if everybody does a little, things will start growing. And so the important thing is youth engagement right now.
Professor Brinkley, thanks for being here tonight, and thanks for all you've done for history. I was wondering, it sounded like your parents were very inspirational in taking you around to national parks throughout your young life. What would be your favorite 2 national parks that you would recommend Americans to go see?
Well, I will answer it because I always make a point of answering questions. I'm also going to throw one at the audience, which is Henry David Thoreau's Walden. I'd ask you, what's your Walden Pond? Where in your life did you go in the natural world that's moved you the most? That if you had to say, it might be your grandmother's farm, it might be, Jekyll Island, it might be, I don't know, but, everybody, and, meaning letting your mind think about how your life was enriched by the natural world, it puts you in a good state when you recall those, because you'll be amazed that they're some of your fondest life memories. On the touring of the national park front, I'm fickle on it, but I would have to say, one I mentioned and that I've really gotten very keen on is Sleeping Bear Dunes in way upstate Michigan, where the dunes along the lake are just these massive rolling dunes, and it's just incredible. And I always love the Smokies. I know it's been over-commercialized, Gatlinburg and the like, but boy, you catch Smokies or Blue Ridge Mountains on the Appalachian, and those are some of the oldest mountains in the world. That part of the Appalachian Mountains, North Carolina, North Georgia, meaning with climate, they're probably a safety zone in the future because of the waterfalls like in Transylvania, North Carolina, and, Piscataway National Forest area, all in there. I think you'll see people moving to North Carolina and North Georgia more and more as climate starts really hitting hard our coastal areas and drought conditions in parts of the Midwest.
We have one more question this evening.
Again, thank you. This has been very informative. There's so much to protect when we talk about the environment, and I'll admit, so you'll know, I'm a trial lawyer for my life, and when we get young people in a room and we're trying to think of what is the theme of our case versus we got these 50 issues. So here we've got everything from batteries to trees to climate. How can we communicate something that really works to the public that we could get behind and say, we can really make a difference here if we focus on these two things? So that seems to me
I
something
think
could help.
I think clean water is really important. But I would tell you this: if I go to a Republican audience, let's just say outside of Cleveland, and I go give a talk to a group there, and if I don't use the word environment, they're much more receptive. It's if I just talk about, shouldn't Lake Erie be clean and we should be able to swim in the lake, and everybody is yes. Shouldn't the Maumee River, not be polluted? Yes. But if you say the word environment more than one or two times, you can feel they're like, oh, you're like a tree hugger. You're, and they start minimalizing you and putting you in a box. And that's unfortunate, but we've got to, and I don't know how one changes a parlance or, a way to say things or to communicate through that, but any sane person wants their kids to grow up in a nice environment. And so you do have a constituency out there, but it's messaging through. So, the wars that are going on in our country right now, I wish I had a way to machete to cut through all that, but I don't. I would think the basic things when you see dirty water like just occurred in Jackson, Mississippi, or Flint and Houston had a shutdown, that's going to happen more and more. And people do not like seeing brown come out of their faucets. And, and I think you just have to find who are we're not demonizing the real polluters enough, people that are breaking environmental laws, and that's where trial lawyers could come in and make a big difference on, Douglas, I'll end with this, but William O. Douglas was so far out there, and if you're, not everybody will appreciate this, but I don't know, you may know this, he was arguing that trees have standing in court. That's how 22nd century he was. He was saying, and then he was arguing, like, if you guys bought a home and, let's say you bought a beachside home outside of Savannah, and you went there because it's next to a national wildlife refuge. So you're buying your dream house, and horrible industrial accident occurs, and it kills off the birds, ruins the salt marshlands. Douglas is arguing that company has to pay you the value of your house before the accident. And that because it's not fair to homeowners or second home people that are buying for a natural setting when it completely gets marred by reckless acts. So he was playing with all these things, Douglas, that still society hasn't caught up with yet. Thank you all.
And we will meet you all out in the lobby if you would like your books signed. There's also a few more copies for sale as well. Thank you so much.